Titan of Mediation, an interview with Dr. Jacqueline Font-Guzman, part of the series Manuso Musing with seasoned mediator trainer Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manuso. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And this is Natalia Łowska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland, this time from Berlin, Germany.
And this is Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manuso, based in Houston, Texas, but broadcasting from Newport, Rhode Island, trainer, mediator, and arbitrator. So today, oops, I am sorry. I want to introduce you, Dr. Jacqueline Font-Guzman. And it is our pleasure that you're here and that you are a new author and a classmate of mine from Nova Southeastern University, where we both received our PhDs in conflict analysis and resolution. So it's given me great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce you on the show today as one of the titans of mediation. And you also serve as the executive director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Eastern Mennonite University. And you're a tenured professor at their Center for Justice and Peace Building. I was quite impressed to also note that you're a Fulbright scholar who has actively participated in the fields of conflict, peace building studies, and diversity, equity, inclusion through national and international conferences and workshops. Your research focuses on marginalized individuals that have created alternative stories and counter narratives to transform or dismantle institutional structural injustices, a huge social conversation right now that I'm just delighted that you and one of my favorite people, Bernie Mayer, have written about in the Neutrality Trap, Disrupting and Connecting for Social Change. And your background is excellent. As I said, you are a Fulbright scholar. You've gotten your bachelor's degree from Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. You have a master's in healthcare administration from St. Louis University in Missouri. And you have a law degree and you're summa cum laude. There's no shock or surprise there for me. You're one of the bright minds and bright lights in our field. And I'm sure that came through from your law background. And you attended the Inter-America University of Puerto Rico School of Law. And as I already mentioned, of course, your PhD from Nova Southeastern University in Florida. So you're certainly qualified and very capable. And we're delighted that you're being one of our titans today on the podcast to talk about what is in your book and what made you write a book that has to do with the social change. We all know that social change is on the table and it's in front of us every day. But where did you find the opening that the dots needed to be connected?
Well, thank you, Barbara, for that humbling introduction. I also remember our fun times when we were at at Nova working together, and it was one of the best things about going there. I always say it was actually the people I met and the connections I
Yes.
made. So I'm really happy that you were one of them, and happy to meet Mac and Natalia also for the first time. So I am originally from Puerto Rico, just to say a little bit about me, and that's probably what you're seeing. My names are hyphenated. Puerto Ricans come to the U.S. and we always like to use our both of our last names. Our Font is my father's last name, and Guzman is my mother's last name. But Americans don't do that, and so it was really hard to let go to that. So the way that many of us who have a hard time letting go of that is we hyphenate our names. So that's a little bit of story about me. But in answer to your question, Barbara, I think that many times as mediators, we don't actually realize that we have a space where we actually have the potential to impact larger social issues. We're just not thinking about it when we get at the table. And so what happened with this book was the reason for this book was my colleague and friend Bernie Mayer, who is a highly obviously well-known international person in terms of conflict, but also not only as a scholar but as a practitioner, had an idea originally of doing a second edition of his book, Beyond Neutrality. And so he started thinking about that. And then we were having conversations, and I had always told him that was one of my favorites books that I have read of him.
And
And
mine.
he realized that what he really needed was not so much a second edition, but a lot more needed to be said. And what triggered it was when Floyd was murdered and all the disruption and social activism that happened around that. And then he realized that even though he brings diversity to the table, because every single one of us does, that he didn't want to write this by himself as the white male writing a book. And so he brought me in to co-write it with him. And so that's sort of where that social justice and that impact started thinking, because the inspiration and what changed where he was headed was actually what happened with Floyd.
And thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Font-Guzman. It's been a pleasure, and we're ever grateful to Dr. Manusso for bringing such honorable and experienced guests to also say something to our listeners and viewers. And taking the advantage of being able to ask Dr. Font-Guzman directly, that says a lot of what you said so far. But when we are looking at the title of the book, it evokes neutrality, but it also says something about social change, whereas the actual core of the book is all about conflict. Tell us, please, how does conflict and social change go together?
Good question.
Thanks for that great question. I think they're intrinsically be connected. I think there is no way we can actually make change if we're not willing to have some conflict in our lives and in our world. Conflict is what triggers in many ways change to happen. When someone is overwhelmed because they're a woman and they're not getting equal rights or equal pay, when someone is black and knows that they're being discriminated against because of who they are and the color of their skin, if there weren't any conflict, if we just sat there and said we'll just deal with it, things would keep on continuing to be the way they are. And so what conflict does is, what we call constructive conflict is to actually have it becomes a conduit to making change by bringing conflict, by saying this is not okay, and by actually causing some disruption and some chaos at times, that is what's going to not only raise the awareness but also allow us to make the change that needs to happen. And so that's why we see conflict and social change connected. And that conflict is a good thing. Is what channels our capacity to be indignant about something, the indignation that comes when we don't have justice for everyone.
Yes.
So I would
So,
take that as your healthy mode as well.
yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I was gonna say what you just ended with, that conflict and justice are connected, right? Because if you see something that's unjust, you're gonna want to do something about it, and that's
Right.
going to make some people mad, and that's going to rub a society, in the quote unquote right way, because it might then lead to some kind of change that eventually happens. I don't know. I think about Dr. King's speech, in his letter from Birmingham jail, where he's talking about, there's the issue of the white liberal, where he goes right for the jugular when he starts, you know, I guess, uh, making people feel uncomfortable on
Mhm.
purpose because of the fact that it's their acquiescence and acceptance of business as usual that actually was leading to people suffering. So
Right.
now, not to go too far into the social change aspect, which I'm passionate about, I love hearing and listening about it. But in our discussion with you as a mediator,
Mhm.
how do we bring all of this back to the typical scenario we see all the time
Yes.
around this country, where it's a mediator who's helping two individuals try to make peace and try to resolve their disputes and their differences? How has that, what your life's work has become, affected you as a mediator?
That is an excellent question and very relevant to actually our book as well, because our book is addressed not only seeing social change as this big thing and big system that we need to change, but actually what is our role as individuals in making that change happen. And mediators and conflict interveners are a very important component of this conversation. And so the way that we can start looking at how these things are connected are by as simple as looking at what are some of the practices and principles that we have held so dearly in mediation. When we say things like, these are kind of the ground rules, one person's going to talk at a time, emotions need to be controlled, it's okay, like getting to yeses, like vent and go out on the balcony and get them out of the way, but then come back and be rational. Well, that really doesn't apply to a significant amount of the population. And I would say it doesn't apply to me specifically. Like, I come from a culture where anger, emotion is the way we walk through conflict and we get it solved. And so when you look at, are we creating spaces in our conversations that actually everyone can engage? Are we doing that? The other thing is, nowadays, and I think Barbara and you alleged to this a little bit before about like women and gender issues. Well, you can't possibly be doing a mediation, for example, in a Catholic or faith-based institution and not be aware, intentionally aware of patriarchy. It informs that conflict, whether it's the conflict that is at the table or not. We may be mediating something completely different, but that is going to be there at the core of that conflict. And so by us thinking of mediation many times in our mediation trainings to focusing on that individual as if they were mutually exclusive and not creating spaces and recognizing that there's a context larger than ourselves, that yes, we won't bring down the patriarchy as much as I would love to in all of the systems, but what we can do is start role modeling what would it look like to be thinking about this and how this actually impacts the conflict of those parties. And so I think the intentionality of that, and I know many mediators do this. Again, I don't want to, I mean, there's a lot of mediators out there that are very much aware of this and trainings that are aware of this. But if you think about it, we are going, those of us who are doing this are going against a lot of those principles that we have held dearly. Like, you need to be objective, you need to be neutral, there's one person needs to talk at a time, emotions are not actually that great. And so that's where I see that space where mediators need to start thinking about what is the larger context in which we are doing a mediation, and how is that influencing the conflict, and how can I advance and help people resolve what they want to resolve, and at the same time planting those seeds, because by planting those seeds, those people are going to go back to their institutions, to their schools, to whatever it is that they're working, their work setting, their families, and you have just given them a tool to actually go and change the system. And so I think that's where I see that role of mediators really happening, and what I would love to strengthen more.
I thank you for saying that. And one of the ideals that I glean from your book, it's absolutely a core for any mediator that they must read to understand their role as a mediator, that it's
Yes.
not as mechanical as some trainings do. I think in our training, I've been doing it almost 30 years. We do try to expand the thought, and we do try to give people more space to be who they need to be to participate. Because a lot of times people are shut down. And I personally have a problem when mediators call it mediation and they put people in a separate space and somebody runs between the rooms. And I think we can agree that that's not really mediation, it's negotiated settlement. And what your book underscores and brings out is the need and the quality of the conversation by using the opportunity to, again, meet people where they are and not have the mediator make it about them as much as it is about the parties. And could you give us an example in the book that you had many, one that might exemplify how that worked so well and brought the participants through a better mediation where their solution was, they were the architects of their solution. So could you maybe address how that, how you use those principles and explain them within the book?
Yes, and I absolutely, before that, I just want to capture something that triggered my mind as you were setting up the question, Barbara, and is, I think that is a juncture and a big opportunity for mediators to start thinking about what is our field about and what is our role, right? Are we about preserving the status quo even in those places where we think that it shouldn't be preserved? Are we about teaching people how to maneuver systems of oppression when we bring them to the mediation table and get an individual solution and move on? Or are we also maybe thinking about how we can go above and beyond that conversation and not only help people maneuver the structures of oppression they're living in, which are important because you know until it all changes, you need to be able to have your life, but at the same time, what can we do to start transforming those institutions and places of oppression? So I think for mediators, this is a very important moment, like for many other professions and disciplines, as to where do we want to take it from here with the changes that have been happening in the world. And so to answer your question in terms of how do we I want clarity on your question, because I think your question was, how do we use these principles, or how have I used these principles in a specific mediation setting? Is that correct?
Yes, to give an example. You had many in the book, but I think for the audience to give a concrete example of how this works.
So I'll give one actually, that of something that I felt didn't work, and it was a great learning experience. I once had this mediation where it was an employee relationship mediation. There was the employer and employee were at the table, and the employee was going to reach a deal that seemed to be good. However, the deal would have prevented him from getting. It was going to impact negatively his pension plan. Now, I'm a mediator and I'm also a lawyer, but I was there as a mediator. And, and as I'm sitting there struggling, right, with all these principles, I need to be neutral. I need to be objective.
Sure.
I need to not be given legal advice. I need not to be given legal counsel. And I'm sitting there to make things more complicated. The attorney of the employer's side was extremely competent. The attorney of the employee, unfortunately, was not. And so it was clear to me that that what was going to happen was a travesty, because this person was making a decision without having everything that was available to him. And as a in my lawyer practice, I had done employment mediation, right? So I actually was very much aware of what was going on. And so I kept on, given time. I'll give you some time to consult with your lawyers, because both of them were there. I'll give you some time to check out the rules and regulations. I'll give you some time. It's just like I literally just ran out. And at one point in time, and maybe it did work, or maybe it was part of that that made the attorney from the employer side reflect about, this is morally wrong what I'm doing. I do want an agreement, but I don't want to railroad someone into making an agreement on the other side that's going to hurt him. That the employer attorney then, in one of the breaks that we had, where I had them say, why don't you go consult, look at the pros, look at the cons, look at the rule. Like, I mean, I was just running out of like possibilities shortly than saying, go get a new lawyer. Like, your lawyer is really like not making this happen for you. And so the attorney of the employer, actually, who was the competent one, came back, printed out the rules and regulations, and literally sat with the other attorney and said, what you're doing is going to hurt your client. But if you want to sign the agreement, at least it should be an informed consent of what are the consequences for him. And so they sat down and they actually got to a different agreement, but the pension of that person was preserved. And so what we do in the mediator table, that sounds like we're just actually just solving an individual need. That opened the space for me way after the mediation was over to actually circle back to the attorney. And this is the part where we can make some change as mediators. Of course, you're
Sure.
not going to do it in the mediation. I mean, you do
Sure.
have to preserve, what the mediations are for. But what it did allow me was to go to the employer attorney, which I knew, and say, this is it was a federal regulation, and those things change like on a daily basis. I said, I think there should be a responsibility here to provide information to the attorneys that are coming to the mediation table about certain things. Like, should we do something different moving forward? And so it allowed a space to create this institution to be clearer, so that people were not to balance that power somehow. And so we usually just stop sometimes. Okay, successful mediation, we're done. And I guess what I'm inviting mediators to do is, don't stop there. If you're aware of the institutional injustices that are happening and the travesties of justice that can happen, even in a mediation setting, our field was actually created, a mediation, to actually fix that in a way, like to create an alternative to a
Sure.
place where you don't have that control. And so I think this is an invitation for mediators. If you are thinking about the social aspects also and the institutional aspects, there's things you can do afterwards.
And back to, again, the essence of the book for us and for everybody listening and viewing. I'm going through it. I thought to a degree that some of the suggestions in your book seem disturbing from the first glance, like deepening the conflict, enduring the conflict. We are brought up the way that we are either to avoid conflicts, or to resolve them immediately, or to escape where they arise. And you say, stay in the conflict and do something wise about it. Why is that? And what should we do?
Why is that for me? Is because the alternative for me, as a person committed to this field and to social change and to the field of mediation and conflict in general, is that the alternative for me is not an option. That the alternative of not deepening or disrupting or being disruptive in some ways and staying with that conflict means that the status quo would remain the same. And for me, the status quo, when it's actually oppressing women, Black men and women, African American descendants, LGBTQ, IA plus communities, that is not acceptable to me, because I know collectively we can do better. And so that's the why for me. That's what drives me to do this. The how is, we need to start shifting our way of thinking as to what our field is really about. And I think historically it has been, in many ways, unintentionally so, preserving the status quo by using many of these principles that we have been using, like you just named like two or three, right? Like, we should not go too much into deepening the conflict, because maybe then the conflict won't be solved. And so it will create disruption, and that may not be a good thing. And I think what we need to really learn how to do is to be okay with staying with that conflict and asking people, what does that really mean in their lives, and feel comfortable with that in ways that we had not ever been comfortable before. And I think that the reason is because at the end of the day, we do really want to reach some sort of agreement. And I also think, in the context of lawyers, and lawyers like myself who have, are doing mediations or are going at the table to represent clients at a mediation, is that our training has been always focused on individual rights, and it's really really hard for us to snap out of that mentality. And so I think the way we do this is by recognizing and starting to recognize that dialogue is great, conversation is great, trying to understand each other is great, it's essential, it's crucial to solving conflict. But if you really truly want to change the status quo, if you really truly want to have social change, if you really truly want employees, if it's an employment setting or a family setting mediation, to be empowered to go back to their systems that they're operating in that are oppressive to them, we need to be able to role model that at the table. And the way that that is role model is by acknowledging that yes, it's okay, the system sucks, the system is not built with you in mind, whether it be a family legal issue, whether it's an institutional issue of unemployment, whether it's issues of healthcare. The systems are not built for everyone. They're built for very specific group of peoples that had the power, and we're not used to sharing power, and we're not used to putting that on the table out there. And I think we need to engage with that. I think otherwise, I think we fall into the neutrality trap.
Thank you so much for that. So, wanted to pivot a little bit toward intersectionality. You
Yes.
have an entire chapter devoted to this, chapter 3 specifically in your
Hmm.
book, and I wanted to read just one paragraph,
Okay.
from that. But before I do, intersectionality to me is has been dealt with mainly in the social sphere when we're talking about this kind of stuff. Whenever we're talking about
Hmm.
gender equity or racial inequality, and we are trained to understand that systems intersect with each other, and if somebody is black and they face a certain discrimination, but they also are a woman, then they might have a double negative, society wise, against them, now that they have to overcome when it comes to trying to reach equality in their society. And so when we bring it down to the level of the mediator working with
Hmm.
people across the table from them, um, this how much, and I'm going to get to the question, but this goes this this impacts how much a mediator needs to know about the people who he or she is sitting across from. Because if they only believe that, well, this individual faces X and I'm able to identify with them, and they forget that this individual also faces Y, then it might make it really hard to build rapport and actually help them facilitate a discussion that's going to create breakthroughs and resolving solutions. So that to me is what intersectionality is, and then how it intersects with the mediator level. Wanted to get your take on that, but first let me read this section from your book.
Hmm.
These various warnings reflected my intersectional identity. Some of my colleagues were seeing me as white and as a woman. My Latinx friends were seeing me as a Puerto Rican woman from the Caribbean who spoke with an accent. My native language is Spanish. My whiteness provided certain privileges with my white colleagues that my black or darker skinned friends did not have, including concern for my physical safety. However, at the intersection of my whiteness and Caribbean identity, my whiteness started to wane, and with it, my privilege. My relocation from Puerto Rico to Omaha highlighted my Caribbean otherness. I went from dealing with the challenges of being a woman in a straight male dominated world to the complexity of bigotry and privilege at the intersection of race, national origin, and gender. Says a mouthful because you you were now having to deal with a multifaceted uh, world where multiple identities come together, and
Hmm.
you want people to treat you fairly, but not just in regards to race, not just in regards to gender, but in regards to your full self. So can you bring that down for us to the mediator level? What advice would you give to mediators on how they should approach a
Yep.
person who's sitting across from them?
So this is such a deep topic, right? We could probably be talking about it for hours, but I think the gist of it is, and the term of intersectionality was developed and originated from Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a lawyer, who is a lawyer, and this was a litigated case where, because the law breaks down into parts, every single action, most of the part, this woman that were black and also woman they were only seen as one thing and not both, and they actually were deprived of working rights. And the way this gets down to mediators, and my call to all of you who are mediators is, you have an amazing opportunity for this not to happen at the mediation table, because you don't have to operate the way the law does. You can have someone come in and be able to be their authentic selves and share their full humanity. And you can do this because you have an opportunity of, what are you asking in your pre-interview questions about individuals? How are you getting to know them? And we all do that. We all have our different variations of intake and what we do. Are we being intentional about trying to be invitational about having people try to share who they are? So that's where I would start, right? I used to always start with the mediation, trying to really learn more about the person. Now, what prevents that from happening? That we're supposed to be objective and neutral, and we can connect with the person across that we're mediating for. And I will say, you can only be a really effective mediator if you can actually connect with the parties. That you will be far more effective, and that you will be far more helpful to them and serve them if you can connect with them. And we don't allow that to happen because we're supposed to be objective and neutral. And you cannot make change. At the core of all of this is, you cannot, this is my own personal opinion, you cannot make change if you don't build relationships with people. If I am incapable of reaching across the table with someone who is different than me, and difference can be shaped in many ways and forms. If I am not willing to do that, I cannot understand what you're going through, and I cannot be of service to you. And I think that that is a big obstacle in the way mediations have been taking place. So it's okay to get to know the person you're mediating with. It's okay to know something about their background. It's okay to bring in their humanity at the table, because you have the power to do that as a mediator. That is one of the most beautiful, amazing powers that we have. That's one of the things I shifted many ways from litigation to mediation. I could design a process where the flaws that were present in the litigation world and system and judicial system could not happen or could be minimized. And so I think that's where it happens. And again, don't fall into that neutrality trap. Be able to know who the people are. It's okay to connect with them. What is not okay in the mediation context would be to start taking sides, right? And start saying, no, I'm just going to fully like help this person and forget about the other one and be a full advocate. But it's also okay to raise conflict in the middle of a mediation when someone says a racist statement. It's okay to not be neutral. In fact, it is what you should do from my perspective. Someone says a racist comment, someone says a misogynist comment. As a mediator, it's okay to call that and say and name it and mention it. Because I think that goes at the core of social justice. Everyone needs to be in a process that equally serves them. And the second that imbalance comes to the point where you are attacking someone for their gender or their race or their ethnicity or whatever it is, mediators need to step in and say, no, not at my table. And we struggle with that because of the mediation principles. We struggle with getting to connect with our clients. We struggle to getting to, I mean, I still remember one of the many early on trainings I went at mediation over, oh my God, I don't know, probably over 15 years, 20 years or more. And I remember that there was a section about you can get to know them, you can get to befriend them, you can get, and I was sitting there in Puerto Rico thinking, this is the only way we do things back home, by connecting with others. And so that would be my invitation to mediators, to start thinking about, what is my role, and has that shifted in the last 20, 30, 40, or 50 years that you've been doing this? Is there a time for change? Is there a time for shift?
Well, Dr. Font-Guzman, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. And certainly your book will be, or is, because it's already out there, the seminal book for any mediator to really find themselves, to find their voice, to find their courage, and to find their professionalism to be able to help their clients. Mediation is not a race to the end. It's not about the money. It's about the parties having a quality conversation where, as you said, they can feel authentic and they can bring to the table what's important to them to help them become the architects of their solution. Because we are not walking in their shoes, but we have to be aware of what their shoes are. And to do this, your book, The Neutrality Trap, I think is absolutely the underscore and the social change, agent of change that is needed for the mediation community. So I applaud you with loudness and great honor and everything that you deserve. And we look forward to a conversation with Dr. Bernie Mayer and both of you together as we continue this dialogue, because it's absolutely essential and it's the driving force of what mediation should be all about. Are there any other closing remarks, Natalie or Matt?
There is so much more to say, and I'm really looking forward to that. I think that our listeners and viewers will also want to know more about the social justice, how you see that and how we can achieve that, even from our little rooms or even our mediation rooms, online mediation rooms when we are there. And also how those findings that you express in the book, how to deal with conflict, how to make it a transformative power, to apply them in our own lives, actually everywhere we go, because some of those remarks are universal. So very happy that we'll be meeting you again.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Font-Guzman. And for those who might be listening, I do have on my screen share right now image of her book, The Neutrality Trap. Dr. Font-Guzman, how can people get this book if they're looking for it?
Yes, well, first of all, I want to thank all three of you for such a wonderful conversation and inviting me to your program. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And the book can be found in the Wiley website. It is published by Wiley. It also can be found in Amazon and pretty much any electronic or online place that is selling books. But those are the two that usually people would be more familiar with.
All right. Thank you so much. And guys, with that, we're wrapping this episode up. We went a little bit over, but I just couldn't help it. I mean, we had so much. I mean, there's so much else I want to keep talking to you about, but because of time, we gotta go. So we'll definitely have you on again. Until next time, this has been Mac Pierlui.
Natalia Orska-Czajka.
And Dr. Barbara Sunderland Manuso.
All right,
Thank you.
guys. Take care. Thank you so much, Dr. Font-Guzman.
Thank you.